You step into your time machine, hear the hum of the flux capacitor whirring to life, and your finger hovers over the dashboard. Where do you want to go? Or more importantly, when do you want to go? As it happens, there's not a lot of places in history more interesting to visit than medieval South India. There were metropolitan cities here rivaling ancient Alexandria or Rome. Indian kings built towering temples and irrigation networks using profits from a roaring spice trade that had everyone from Western Europe to the Middle East desperate for a taste of these Eastern exotics. In this video, I'll be your tour guide through medieval South India. As you walk among armored elephants marching to war, navigate through the bustling markets of a dusty Deccan city, and wander through spectacular temples and palaces built by expert craftsmen. So sit back, time traveler, relax, and let us begin our journey to see what it was like to be alive in South India more than 1000 years ago. The doors of the time machine swing open and you step out into the dry, sweltering heat of the North Deccan. And immediately before you stretches an imposing cliff face made of dark volcanic basalt. All along the length of these cliffs, you see a retinue of people making their way into low, shadowy caves. They carry baskets of flowers and coconuts and incense, passing between pillars and statues carved from the very cliff face. These are no ordinary caves. They're a vast complex of Hindu, Buddhist and Jain temples that, instead of being built with bricks or blocks of stone, were created by cutting straight into the rock. There's almost nothing like it anywhere else in the world. We are in Ellora, the great megalopolis of 34 cave temples that had begun over 200 years before. But something catches your eye. Yet another construction site atop the rock face where workers are toiling in the morning sun, chiseling away at the rock with large hammers. If you were to ask one of them what it was, they'd tell you it was an offering from their king, the great Krishna Rashtrakuta, to the Lord Shiva. They say it'll be incredibly grand, unlike anything the world has ever seen. We'll be checking back on this mysterious mega project later, but for now, let's go and see what this ambitious Rashtrakuta royal is up to. We travel more than 500 kilometers over the Deccan Plateau, sailing across the restless waters of the Godavari, taking the help of local farmers or traders riding their bullock carts from one village or town to another. If you had arrived in this region just 200 years earlier, I would not have advised you to take the road like this unless you had a retinue of armed guards to protect you. Dacoity and highway robbery were a fact of life back in the days before the rise of the Chalukya Empire in the mid-6th century. Before that, the Deccan was a dusty, largely lawless region with not much in the way of urbanization or trade. Think of the Wild West, but instead of cowboy hats and revolvers, it was turbans and handmade sickles. That still doesn't mean that the roads are safe where we are now in the 8th century. You should still definitely travel with a large group to avoid being targeted. Merchants would often hire armed mercenaries to protect their precious cargo, so it would be best if you hitched a ride with them. On your way, you pass by farmers working fields of rice, millets, cereal grains, sugarcane, pepper, and beans. While all of these are still commonly grown today in India, you won't see staple crops like chili, potato, tomato, and peanuts. We'll see why when we reach the city. As the road crests a small hillock, the city of Manakara comes into view, the imposing capital of the mighty Rashtrakuta Empire, standing proud over the banks of the Kagina river. Even from a distance, you can see the great sandstone walls of the city wrapped around a profusion of buildings, houses, temples, and towers. Now, this is a city, not like those small villages and two-horse towns you passed by. As you pass through the massive gates, you're assaulted by the sights, sounds, colors, and smells of a city bursting with vigor. This was at a time when the Rashtrakutas were expanding their territory farther than any Deccan power before or since. From their capital in northern Karnataka, the Rashtrakuta war machine would trample everything in its path, reaching as far north as the Ganga river valley and as far south as Sri Lanka. The exploits of these kings have been likened to those of Alexander the Great, and Arab travelers would call this empire one of the 4 greatest empires in the world, the others being the Byzantine Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate, and the Egyptian Empire. The city we're in now is the beating political heart of this enormous South Indian power. But I'm gonna have to temper your expectations a little. As impressive as it is, Manyakheta is still rather small by the standards of our modern day megacities, with a few 100,000 people living there. But it's no less complex and fascinating to visit. The streets are lined with hawkers and vendors selling all manner of brightly colored textiles, cheap jewelry, and simple wooden toys. Carts laden with small mountains of pepper, cloves, cardamom, and turmeric stand next to vegetable carts piled high with eggplant, bitter gourd, beans, and more. Remember how I said you won't see things like potatoes, tomatoes, or chilies here? Well, that's because they straight up didn't exist at this time in India. Indians would first see these exotic foods nearly 800 years later, being hauled out of Portuguese cargo ships arriving from the other end of the world. Much of what makes up staple Indian cuisine today actually comes from North and South America. Isn't it crazy to think that these medieval Indians, the people who worshipped the same gods in the same temples we do today, who spoke old Kannada or Tamil or Telugu, had never tasted a masala dosa or dipped their idlis in coconut chutney? Nevertheless, these ancestors were people just like us and were no less interested in acquiring luxuries like exotic perfumes from Persia or handcrafted porcelain from China. But you should be careful while you browse the open-air markets of Manyakheta. Pickpockets abound in the bustling streets, and shopkeepers are likely to swindle you if you come across as a clueless foreigner. Haggling is as important a skill now as it would have been 1,000 years ago. As you venture deeper into the city, you will pass by fortune tellers and palm readers, musicians performing to clapping crowds, courtesans using their bewitching charms to draw in customers, blacksmiths forging tools in front of roaring coal furnaces, and florists selling fragrant garlands. Not all smells in the city are pleasant though, as you'll encounter a fair number of elephants and horses plodding through the wider pavilions, carelessly depositing dung wherever they please. Just make sure you're not at the wrong place at the wrong time. By now, we should be at the gates of the Emperor's Palace, a mighty complex of sandstone buildings at the epicenter of Manyakheta. Soldiers watch over the city and its surroundings from tall watchtowers. Guards block the entrance to the palace with crossed spears, carefully inspecting every visitor before allowing them to pass. You manage to slip by along with a traveling theatre troupe who will be presenting a show for the Emperor's court tonight. The palace courtyard is a vast open space with expertly maintained gardens bursting with colorful blossoms, fruit-bearing trees offering much-needed shade from the heat, and fountains sporting ornate designs. The richly carved pillars and edifices of the palace feature dancing figures, gods, and animals, all brightly painted with dyes made from ingredients like charcoal, plant sap, cow dung, flowers, and minerals. When you see old palaces or temples in the modern day with bare, colorless rock, that's not actually how they used to look back in the day. Medieval Indians loved to paint their statues and important buildings in bright colors, and you can see evidence of this in the Ajanta caves, where there was no sunlight or rain to wash away the paint. Of course, the practice of painting the temple is still prevalent in some places, like the Madurai Meenakshi temple. Now back to the Rashtrakuta palace. If you went to one side of the massive palace grounds, you would find the royal stables, where the emperor's prized horses and elephants would be kept. Sturdy iron cuffs linked to chains hold these powerful war elephants in place, allowing their handlers to bathe and feed them. At this very moment, the emperor himself has arrived to welcome a group of Arab traders who have brought with them a large shipment of the finest horses from the Middle East. Medieval Indian emperors were famously fond of their majestic royal steeds and would go to great lengths to import the strongest, fastest horses in the world directly from the Arab lands. It's clear that the emperor is planning a new campaign somewhere beyond the Deccan, and a strong cavalry is an essential unit of any capable army. But these aren't the only preparations underway for the emperor's upcoming campaign. Just beyond the city walls, the queen herself is seeking audience with the Lord Shiva at the local temple to pray for his victory in the battles to come. Hundreds of villagers from the surrounding area have come to catch a glimpse of the impressive royal retinue with its horses and palanquins and flag bearers. Shopkeepers would be doing brisk business, selling snacks and refreshing coconut water to the excited crowds. It's interesting to think that just a couple hundred years before, the very concept of worshipping a deity in a temple was kind of a foreign concept to the people of South India. That was really more of a North Indian practice. Local gods often didn't even take the form of an idol, and people would worship trees or stones at sacred locations. But it was the Deccan kings, starting with the Chalukyas, who borrowed the concept of temple worship and took it to unprecedented heights. They pioneered unique architectural styles totally distinct from those in the north, like these star-shaped designs, and competed with each other to build taller, grander structures. And I know what you're thinking. Why waste so much money and manpower on temples? Why not invest in infrastructure for the benefit of the public? But here's the thing. Combine temple with a bank, a municipal corporation, a marketplace, and a school, and then you're getting close to what temples represented in medieval India. Temples used to receive vast tracts of land from the king and could act as landlords. They built vast irrigation networks and reservoirs to help farmers. They maintained massive treasuries so they could lend money, and the area around a temple was a hub of activity, crowded with shops, handicrafts, and industries. Hundreds of people would be employed by the temples as officials and teachers, and thousands of underprivileged people came to temples to receive free meals. You still see some of this in modern Indian temples, but their ancestors were inseparably intertwined with the day-to-day of their local communities. It's basically impossible to imagine a medieval India without its iconic temples. So as we make our way back to the place we started, keep in mind that what the stonemasons of Ellora are preparing isn't just a temple, it's a socio-political institution. You arrive at the construction site at night and can see the grand structure beginning to take shape. Slender pillars, tall towers, and a gigantic central chamber. It's still far from finished, of course, but for now, the workers are taking a break for the night. These are no mere laborers, they are skilled artisans, many of whom are part of powerful guilds and have come from far and wide to work on the king's magnum opus. But right now, they're just people. They sit around bonfires, gulping down some awful tasting alcohol, and tell each other stories. It'll be nearly 20 years before the temple is completed, in which time many of them will have grown old, would have seen their children grow up and get married, perhaps to each other's sons and daughters, and they'll have formed lifelong friendships with the other men working with them. Imagine devoting 2 decades of your life on a single project, which in those days was nearly half your entire life, at the end of which you'll have built something that will last thousands of years. The modern world simply has no equivalent. But we're off again, this time to our final stop at the foothills of the Western Ghats, where the forest grows as wildly as the men marching through it. Because we find ourselves among the travelling war camp of the Rashtrakuta Empire, which can only be described as a miniature city unto itself. While the emperor himself is making preparations back in Manakara, his general leads a massive army north. The camp is sprawling, a churn of activity and sound amidst the otherwise silent forest. Hundreds of soldiers and servants mill about the area. Armorers prepare weapons and armor for their warriors, the most elaborate of which is, of course, reserved only for the nobles and chieftains who have joined the war party. Horses whinny in protest as their handlers fit saddles and armor onto them, and the elephants lazily munch on leaves as their mahouts arm their tusks with large, painful-looking spikes. In the fury of battle, these creatures will become unstoppable killing machines that can flatten entire units of infantry or cavalry without the slightest resistance. As impressive as all this is, it's important to remember that these aren't professional armies like what the Roman Empire had over 2000 years ago. These men aren't all trained soldiers. Many of them are lowly farmers or day laborers or even tribals who have been conscripted into the army with the promise of glory and looted riches. They're not paid a salary and certainly don't enjoy the retirement benefits of a military veteran in India today. This should serve as a sobering reminder that as much as we look to the past to relive the glory of a bygone era, the world back then was in most ways much harsher, scarier, and more unjust than anything you see today. In a few short days, this army will come face to face with a powerful enemy in the north, but let's leave talk of warfare and military strategy for another video. It's getting late, and I think it's time to bring our travels through time to an end. Let's cross the dusty roads back to the place it all began. But now, the scene has changed significantly. What you're looking at is perhaps the single greatest triumph of medieval architecture anywhere in the world. An entire massive temple carved out of a single monolith. The skill with which these artisans would have to craft these exquisite pillars, entrances, and images is extraordinary. After 18 long years, it's finally complete. The Kailasa temple at Ellora in current-day Maharashtra. Of course, unlike today, the temple is painted brightly with colors, and to celebrate its grand inauguration, the emperor himself has arrived. Flowers adorn every possible surface of the structure. The air is thick with the scent of incense, and the place reverberates with the tinkle of bells and the voices of the priests offering mantras to the Lord. The celebrations are just beginning and will go on for days to come. Traveling poets will sing to the devotees, puppeteers will entertain children with whimsical stories, and enough sweets will be made and eaten to feed the entire Rashtrakuta army. But once all the revelry is done and the pilgrims go home satisfied, the temple will sit there, silent among the basalt cliffs of Ellora, where it will remain for the next 1251 years. So, what did you think about this journey into the strange yet somehow familiar world of medieval South India? Obviously, I couldn't cover even a fraction of that period, from the Cholas to the Chalukyas to the Sultanates, but don't worry, those videos will definitely happen at some point, so get subscribed so you don't miss it. A huge portion of this video was inspired by Anirudh Kanisetti's Lords of the Deccan. It's an absolute must-read if you're an Indian history buff. If you like this video, please drop a like below, it really helps. And thanks for watching.